Hello and welcome to History Bedtime Stories. Picture this. A solitary caravan silhouetted against the setting sun, camels laden with precious cargo swaying rhythmically across an endless sea of sand. The jingling of bells mingles with the whispered prayers of merchants who know that beyond the next dune could lie either untold riches or certain death. This is the Silk Road, but not the romanticized version you might imagine. The real Silk Road was far more complex, dangerous, and fascinating than any Hollywood adventure could capture. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple way to support the channel. I am also always curious to know where in the world and at what time are you joining me tonight. So, I would really love to hear from you in the comments. Tonight, we embark on an epic journey across continents and through millennia, following the footsteps of Marco Polo, the whispers of Buddhist monks, and the dreams of merchants who risked everything for a handful of silk threads worth their weight in gold. We'll uncover lost cities buried beneath shifting sands, decode the secrets of ancient trade routes that connected civilizations separated by vast distances, and discover how a network of dusty paths became the internet of the ancient world. The Silk Road wasn't just about commerce. It was about the exchange of ideas, religions, technologies, and dreams. It was where East met West long before globalization became a buzzword, where a Buddhist monastery might stand next to a Zoroastrian fire temple, where Chinese paper met Islamic mathematics, and where the fate of empires hung in the balance of a single trading season. But here's what makes our story even more compelling. Archaeologists and historians are still uncovering new secrets about the Silk Road. Recent discoveries using satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and DNA analysis are revealing trade routes we never knew existed, cities that have been lost for over 1,000 years, and evidence of cultural exchanges that predate our earliest written records by centuries. So settle in for a journey that will take us from the imperial palaces of Qian to the bazaars of Samarkand, from the monasteries of Gandhara to the trading posts of Crimea. We'll ride with merchants across the Taklamakan desert, where entire caravans vanished without a trace, and sail with seafaring traders through the monsoons of the Indian Ocean. We'll witness the rise and fall of trading empires, the birth of new religions, and the slow, inexorable changes that eventually closed the greatest trade network in human history. This is the untold story of how a desire for silk transformed the world, connecting civilizations in ways that still influence our lives today. Welcome to the real Silk Road, where every grain of sand holds a secret, and every ancient ruin whispers tales of adventure, ambition, and human ingenuity that spanned the known world. The story of the Silk Road begins not with a road, but with a worm. Deep in the mountains of ancient China, around 2700 BCE, legend tells us that Empress Lezu was enjoying tea in her garden when a silk cocoon fell into her cup. As she watched the delicate threads unravel in the hot liquid, she realized that these threads could be woven into the most beautiful fabric the world had ever seen. Whether or not this story is true, it captures something essential about the beginning of the Silk Road. It started with a discovery that would change the world. For over 2,000 years, the Chinese maintained an almost supernatural monopoly on silk production. The penalty for revealing the secrets of sericulture was death, and the Chinese went to extraordinary lengths to protect their precious knowledge. Silk became more than just a luxury fabric. It became the foundation of an economic empire that would eventually stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. But the true birth of the Silk Road as we know it began during the Han Dynasty, around 138 BCE, with a man named Zhang. Zhang was not a merchant or a trader. He was a diplomat and explorer whose mission would accidentally create one of the most important trade networks in human history. The Han Emperor Wu had sent Zhang on a seemingly impossible task: to forge an alliance with the Yuezhi people, who lived somewhere in the mysterious lands to the west, in order to combat their mutual enemy, the Xiongnu Confederation. Zhang Qian's journey was epic in scope and tragic in execution. Captured by the Xiongnu shortly after leaving Chinese territory, he spent 10 years in captivity before finally escaping and continuing his mission. By the time he reached the Yuezhi, they had moved even further west and had no interest in returning to fight their former enemies. Zhang Qian's diplomatic mission was a complete failure, but his exploration was a resounding success. When Zhang Qian finally returned to China 13 years after his departure, he brought with him detailed knowledge of the lands and peoples to the west. He had seen the fertile valleys of Bactria, the great cities of Samarkand and Bokhara, and most importantly, he had observed the incredible wealth that could be generated through long-distance trade. Zhang Qian's reports fired the imagination of the Han court. He described horses that sweated blood, grapes that could be turned into wine, and precious stones that glowed with inner light. He spoke of vast marketplaces where goods from all corners of the known world changed hands, and of the enormous profits that Chinese silk could command in these distant markets. The Han dynasty's response was swift and decisive. They established a series of military outposts and trading stations along the routes that Zhang Qian had mapped, creating what would become the backbone of the Silk Road network. These weren't just random settlements. They were carefully planned installations designed to protect Chinese merchants, collect taxes on trade goods, and extend Chinese political influence into Central Asia. The city of Dunhuang, established around 111 BCE, became one of the most important of these trading centers. Located at the edge of the Taklamakan desert, Dunhuang served as the last major Chinese city before traders entered the perilous desert crossing that would take them to the oasis cities of Central Asia. Here, merchants would rest their animals, repair their equipment, and gather information about conditions along the routes ahead. But Dunhuang was more than just a supply depot. It became a melting pot of cultures, religions, and ideas that perfectly captured the spirit of the Silk Road. Buddhist monasteries stood alongside Confucian temples, Zoroastrian fire altars, and later Islamic mosques. The famous Mogeo caves, carved into the cliffs outside the city, contain some of the finest examples of Buddhist art ever created, painted by monks and artists from dozens of different cultures. The establishment of these trading cities created a network effect that transformed the economy of Central Asia. Small oasis settlements grew into major commercial centers practically overnight, as merchants discovered that the profits from long-distance trade far exceeded anything they could earn from local agriculture or crafts. Take the city of Kashgar, for example. Located at the western edge of the Taklamakan desert, Kashgar had been a modest oasis settlement for centuries. But its position at the intersection of routes leading to India, Persia, and the Mediterranean made it incredibly valuable to long-distance traders. Within a few generations, Kashgar had become one of the wealthiest cities in Central Asia, with a population that included merchants from China, India, Persia, Arabia, and the Byzantine Empire. The transformation wasn't limited to the cities along the trade routes. The demand for trade goods created entirely new industries throughout Central Asia. Nomadic tribes that had previously survived through herding and occasional raiding discovered that they could earn far more by breeding horses and camels for the caravan trade, or by providing security services to merchant caravans. The Sogdians, an Iranian people who lived in the region around modern-day Uzbekistan, became perhaps the most successful intermediaries on the Silk Road. They developed a trading network that stretched from China to the Black Sea, and their language became the lingua franca of Central Asian commerce. Sogdian merchants established permanent trading communities in cities throughout the Silk Road network, creating a kind of early multinational corporation that could coordinate trade across vast distances. What made the Sogdians so successful was their understanding that the Silk Road was about much more than just moving goods from point A to point B. They realized that information was often more valuable than merchandise, and they developed sophisticated networks for gathering and sharing intelligence about political conditions, weather patterns, bandit activity, and market prices throughout their trading territory. The Sogdians also pioneered many of the financial innovations that made long-distance trade practical. They created some of the world's first banking systems, allowing merchants to deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another without having to carry large amounts of gold or silver across dangerous terrain. They developed standardized weights and measures that were accepted throughout the Central Asian trading network, and they created legal frameworks for resolving commercial disputes that involved multiple legal systems. But perhaps most importantly, the Sogdians understood that successful trading relationships were built on trust and personal connections that often took generations to develop. Sogdian trading families maintained networks of relatives and business partners that spanned continents, creating a kind of extended family structure that could provide support, information, and financial backing for trading ventures that might take years to complete. The success of these early trading networks attracted the attention of empires throughout the known world. The Romans, who had initially encountered Chinese silk through intermediaries in the markets of Alexandria and Antioch, soon became obsessed with gaining direct access to the source of this precious commodity. Roman writers described silk as being worth its weight in gold, and wealthy Romans would often spend their entire fortunes on silk garments that served as the ultimate status symbol. The Roman demand for silk created what we might recognize today as a massive trade deficit. Roman gold flowed eastward in enormous quantities, while relatively few Roman goods made the journey in the opposite direction. This concerned Roman economists, who worried about the empire's balance of trade, but it delighted Chinese merchants, who found that Roman gold coins were more stable and reliable than Chinese currency for international transactions. The Parthians, who controlled much of the territory between the Roman and Chinese spheres of influence, initially tried to maintain their position as intermediaries by preventing direct contact between Roman and Chinese traders. They spread rumors about the dangers of the eastern routes and the hostility of the Chinese, while simultaneously telling Chinese merchants that the Romans were barbarians who couldn't be trusted. But the potential profits from direct trade were simply too large to be stopped by Parthian propaganda. Roman merchants began to find ways around Parthian territory, either by taking sea routes through the Indian Ocean or by following northern routes through the Caucasus and Central Asia. Chinese merchants, meanwhile, extended their operations further and further west, eventually establishing permanent trading posts in Parthian territory itself. The competition between different trading routes created a complex network of interconnected pathways that historians now call the Silk Roads, plural, rather than a single Silk Road. The traditional overland routes through Central Asia were supplemented by maritime routes through the Indian Ocean, northern routes through the Eurasian steppes, and even seasonal routes across the Himalayan passes. Each of these routes had its own advantages and disadvantages. The overland routes through Central Asia were relatively direct and allowed for regular communication between trading posts. But they were extremely dangerous due to bandits, harsh weather, and political instability. The maritime routes were generally safer and could carry much larger quantities of goods, but they were subject to monsoon seasons and piracy. The northern routes through the steppes were often the fastest, especially during winter when rivers froze and became natural highways, but they required specialized knowledge of nomadic tribal politics and were only practical for certain types of goods. The Himalayan routes provided access to unique products like incense and precious stones from India, but they were only open for a few months each year and required enormous physical endurance from both merchants and pack animals. This diversity of routes created a remarkably resilient trading network that could adapt to changing political and economic conditions. When one route became too dangerous or expensive, merchants could shift to alternatives. When a particular city became hostile to foreign traders, the trade would simply bypass it and flow to more welcoming destinations. The flexibility of the Silk Road network also encouraged innovation and experimentation. Merchants constantly searched for new routes, new products, and new markets. They were among the first people to develop reliable methods for long-distance navigation, weather prediction, and cross-cultural communication. They pioneered techniques for preserving food, purifying water, and treating diseases in harsh environments. But perhaps the most important innovation was the development of what we might call cultural competency. Successful Silk Road merchants had to be able to operate effectively in dozens of different cultures, each with its own languages, religions, legal systems, and social customs. This required a kind of cosmopolitan sophistication that was virtually unknown in the more isolated regions of the ancient world. Many Silk Road merchants were polyglots who could speak 5 or 6 languages fluently and could get by in several others. They understood the basics of multiple religious systems, not necessarily because they were believers, but because religious knowledge was essential for understanding the societies they traded with. They knew the political systems of dozens of different kingdoms and city-states, and they could adapt their business practices to local legal requirements. This cultural sophistication had profound effects on the societies along the Silk Road. Cities that had been relatively isolated and parochial were suddenly exposed to ideas, technologies, and artistic styles from across the known world. Local artisans began incorporating foreign motifs into their work, creating entirely new artistic traditions that blended elements from multiple cultures. Religious syncretism became common, as people encountered belief systems that were radically different from their own, but that offered attractive features or answered questions that their traditional religions had left unresolved. Buddhism spread from India to China largely through the Silk Road network, but it was transformed in the process, incorporating elements from Greek philosophy, Persian mythology, and Chinese folk religion. Technology transfer accelerated dramatically. Chinese innovations like paper, printing, and gunpowder spread westward along the trade routes, while Middle Eastern advances in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine traveled eastward. Indian philosophical concepts influenced Chinese thought, while Chinese administrative techniques were adopted by Central Asian kingdoms. The cumulative effect of these exchanges was to create a kind of Eurasian civilization that transcended political boundaries and cultural differences. A merchant from Constantinople and a merchant from Chang'an might speak different languages and worship different gods, but they shared a common understanding of commercial law, diplomatic protocol, and cosmopolitan values that made cooperation possible despite their differences. This Eurasian civilization reached its first peak during the Tang dynasty in China, roughly from 618 to 907 CE. The Tang capital of Chang'an became the largest city in the world, with a population that may have exceeded 1 million people. The city was genuinely international, with permanent communities of merchants from every major civilization in the known world. Chang'an during the Tang period was a city where you could hear dozens of languages spoken in the streets, where restaurants served cuisine from across Eurasia, and where the fashion trends might be influenced by styles from Persia, India, or Central Asia. The Tang court itself was remarkably cosmopolitan, with foreign generals, administrators, and advisors holding high positions in the government. The Tang dynasty's openness to foreign influence was not just a matter of tolerance. It was a deliberate strategy for maintaining China's position as the dominant power in East Asia. By welcoming foreign merchants, scholars, and diplomats, the Tang court gained access to the latest developments in technology, military tactics, and political organization from across the known world. This strategy was incredibly successful. Tang China became not only the wealthiest and most powerful empire in the world, but also the most culturally influential. Chinese art, literature, and political ideas spread throughout East Asia, while the Chinese writing system was adopted by Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. The Tang legal code became the basis for legal systems throughout the region, and Chinese educational methods were copied by neighboring kingdoms. But the very success of the Tang dynasty created problems that would eventually threaten the stability of the Silk Road network. As Chinese power and influence grew, other empires began to view China as a threat rather than a trading partner. The Islamic expansion of the 7th and 8th centuries brought new powers into Central Asia that were often hostile to Chinese influence. The Battle of Talas in 751 CE marked a turning point in Silk Road history. Chinese and Arab armies clashed in what is now Kazakhstan, and the Chinese were defeated. More importantly, from a historical perspective, Chinese prisoners captured in the battle included papermakers who revealed the secrets of paper production to their Arab captors. Within a generation, paper mills were operating throughout the Islamic world, breaking China's monopoly on one of its most important exports. The Battle of Talas didn't immediately end Chinese involvement in the Silk Road, but it marked the beginning of a more complicated and competitive phase in the network's development. Instead of a relatively stable system dominated by Chinese and Roman demand, the Silk Road became a contested space where multiple empires competed for control of the most lucrative trade routes. The Abbasid Caliphate, which ruled much of the Middle East from their capital in Baghdad, became a major player in the Silk Road trade. Baghdad itself became one of the most important commercial centers on the network, rivaling Constantinople and Chang'an in terms of wealth and international connections. The Abbasids actively promoted trade and commerce, viewing merchant activity as essential to the prosperity of their empire. Islamic merchants brought new approaches to long-distance trade that transformed the Silk Road in fundamental ways. They developed more sophisticated credit systems, insurance mechanisms, and partnership structures that made it easier to finance large-scale trading ventures. They created standardized contracts and commercial laws that were recognized throughout the Islamic world, reducing the legal uncertainties that had previously made international trade so risky. Perhaps most importantly, Islamic merchants were often motivated by religious as well as commercial considerations. The Islamic concept of jihad included economic competition with non-Muslim powers, and many Islamic merchants saw their trading activities as a form of religious service that helped spread Islamic influence throughout the known world. This religious dimension of Islamic trade had profound effects on the development of the Silk Road network. Islamic merchants were often willing to take greater risks and accept lower profits than their non-Muslim competitors if their activities helped spread Islamic influence. They established mosques and Islamic schools in trading cities throughout Central Asia, creating permanent centers of Islamic culture that gradually converted local populations. The spread of Islam along the Silk Road was not simply a matter of military conquest or forced conversion. In many cases, local rulers and merchants converted to Islam because they recognized that membership in the Islamic commercial network provided significant economic advantages. Islamic merchants tended to give preferential treatment to fellow Muslims, offering better terms of trade and more reliable partnerships to those who shared their faith. This created a positive feedback loop that accelerated the spread of Islam throughout the Silk Road network. As more trading centers became predominantly Islamic, it became increasingly advantageous for non-Muslim merchants to convert in order to maintain their competitive position. Within a few centuries, most of the major trading cities along the Central Asian routes had become predominantly Muslim. The Islamization of the Silk Road had important consequences for the network's relationship with China. While the Tang dynasty had been remarkably tolerant of religious diversity, successive Chinese dynasties became increasingly suspicious of foreign influence, particularly Islamic influence. The Song dynasty, which succeeded the Tang, adopted much more restrictive policies toward foreign trade and foreign merchants. Instead of welcoming foreign traders to Chinese cities, the Song established designated border markets where international commerce could be conducted under strict government supervision. Chinese merchants were discouraged from traveling abroad, and foreign merchants were required to obtain special permits and were restricted to specific areas within Chinese territory. These policies reflected broader changes in Chinese attitudes toward the outside world. Where the Tang had seen foreign contact as a source of strength and innovation, the Song increasingly viewed it as a source of contamination and instability. This shift in attitude was partly a response to military pressures from nomadic peoples on China's northern borders, but it also reflected a growing confidence in Chinese civilization and a corresponding disdain for foreign cultures. The Chinese retreat from active participation in the Silk Road created opportunities for other peoples and empires to fill the void. The Mongols, in particular, would eventually create the largest and most efficient trading network in world history. But before we turn to the Mongol period, we need to understand how the Silk Road operated on a day-to-day basis during its classical period. The logistics of Silk Road trade were incredibly complex. A typical caravan might include several hundred people and animals, carrying goods worth enormous sums and traveling distances that could take months or even years to complete. The organization required for such expeditions was comparable to what we might associate with military campaigns or space missions in the modern world. The first challenge was simply assembling a caravan. Merchants rarely had enough capital to finance an entire expedition by themselves, so they had to find partners who could contribute goods, animals, or expertise to the venture. These partnerships were often extraordinarily complex, involving dozens of different parties with different levels of investment and different claims on the profits. A typical trading partnership might include the primary organizer, who conceived the expedition and took responsibility for its overall success. Financial backers who provided capital in exchange for a share of the profits. Goods suppliers who contributed merchandise to be sold. Transport specialists who provided animals and equipment. Guards who provided security. And local guides who had knowledge of specific routes and regions. Each member of the partnership had specific rights and responsibilities that were carefully negotiated before the expedition began. These agreements had to account for a huge range of potential problems. What would happen if some of the animals died, if the caravan was attacked by bandits, if political conditions prevented access to certain markets, or if key members of the expedition became sick or died during the journey. The legal frameworks for these partnerships evolved over centuries of trial and error, creating sophisticated commercial law that was recognized throughout the Silk Road network. These laws had to balance the need for flexibility, since conditions could change dramatically during a long journey, with the need for certainty, since investors required predictable returns to justify the enormous risks involved in long-distance trade. Once a caravan was organized and financed, the next challenge was route planning. The Silk Road network included hundreds of different possible paths between any two major cities, and the optimal route could change based on seasonal weather patterns, political conditions, bandit activity, and market prices at various destinations. Successful merchants maintained extensive intelligence networks that provided information about conditions throughout the trading network. They might spend months gathering information and waiting for optimal conditions before committing to a particular route. In some cases, caravans would change their destination entirely during the journey if they received information about better opportunities elsewhere. The physical challenges of Silk Road travel were enormous. The Taklamakan Desert, which lay at the heart of the Central Asian trade network, was one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Summer temperatures could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, while winter temperatures could drop below zero. Sandstorms could last for days, making navigation impossible and burying entire caravans. Water was always a critical concern. Caravans had to carry enough water for their animals as well as for the human members of the expedition, but water was heavy and took up valuable cargo space. The location of reliable water sources along the desert routes was closely guarded information that could mean the difference between life and death. The choice of animals was crucial to the success of any expedition. Camels were preferred for desert crossings because of their ability to carry heavy loads for long distances without water, but they were expensive to purchase and maintain. Horses were faster and more reliable in mountainous terrain, but they required more frequent feeding and watering. Yaks were essential for high-altitude routes but were useless in desert conditions. Most large caravans used a combination of different animals, choosing the mix based on their intended route and cargo. A caravan heading from China to Central Asia might start with horses and mules, switch to camels for the desert crossing, and then add yaks if they plan to cross mountain passes. The human component of caravans was equally diverse. In addition to the merchants and their employees, caravans typically included religious pilgrims, diplomatic envoys, scholars, artisans, and refugees. This diversity could be a source of strength, since different members of the caravan brought different skills and knowledge, but it could also create problems when conflicts arose between people from different cultures and backgrounds. Leadership of caravans was a specialized skill that required knowledge of dozens of different fields. A successful caravan leader had to be part diplomat, part military commander, part logistics expert, and part cultural anthropologist. They had to be able to negotiate with local rulers, organize defenses against bandits, manage complex supply chains, and mediate disputes between people who might not even speak the same language. The goods carried by Silk Road caravans were as diverse as the people who transported them. Silk was the most famous commodity, but it was never the only one, and in many cases it wasn't even the most valuable. Spices, precious stones, perfumes, medicines, and luxury foods often commanded higher prices than silk, especially in markets where silk had become relatively common. The trade also included many bulk commodities that were less glamorous but often more profitable. Iron, copper, tin, and other metals were traded in large quantities, as were textiles, leather goods, and manufactured items like tools and weapons. Even exotic animals were part of the trade, with wealthy collectors in Rome and China willing to pay enormous sums for rare birds, big cats, and other curiosities. But perhaps the most valuable cargo carried by Silk Road merchants was information. News about political developments, military movements, technological innovations, and market conditions was worth its weight in gold to merchants and rulers throughout the network. Merchants who could provide reliable intelligence about distant regions could command premium prices for their services, regardless of what physical goods they might be carrying. The exchange of information along the Silk Road had profound effects on the development of human knowledge. Scientific and technological advances spread much more rapidly than they would have in a more isolated world. Mathematical concepts developed in India reached Europe centuries earlier than they would have through other means. Chinese inventions like the compass and printing press were available in the Middle East and Europe much sooner than would otherwise have been possible. Religious ideas traveled even faster than technological innovations. Buddhism spread from India to China and beyond largely through the Silk Road network, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and monks who found that trade routes provided the most reliable means of long-distance travel. Christianity spread into Central Asia and China through the same routes, as did Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, and eventually Islam. The religious diversity of Silk Road cities created unprecedented opportunities for intellectual exchange between different faith traditions. Scholars and theologians from different religions found themselves living in the same communities and engaging in debates about fundamental questions of existence, morality, and spirituality. These exchanges often led to new synthetic religious movements that combined elements from multiple traditions. The artistic and cultural exchanges facilitated by the Silk Road were equally profound. Artistic styles that had developed in isolation for centuries suddenly encountered foreign influences that transformed them beyond recognition. Greco-Buddhist art, which combined Greek sculptural techniques with Buddhist religious themes, emerged from these cultural encounters and influenced artistic development throughout Central and East Asia. Musical instruments, literary forms, architectural styles, and decorative motifs all spread along the trade routes, creating a cosmopolitan artistic culture that transcended regional and ethnic boundaries. A single building in a major Silk Road city might incorporate architectural elements from China, Persia, India, and the Greco-Roman world, creating entirely new aesthetic traditions that couldn't have emerged in more isolated environments. The culinary exchanges were no less significant. Spices, cooking techniques, and food preservation methods spread throughout the Silk Road network, fundamentally transforming regional cuisines. Many foods that we now consider characteristic of particular cultures actually reached those regions through Silk Road trade. Noodles may have traveled from China to Italy, while winemaking techniques spread from the Mediterranean to Central Asia and China. But the Silk Road was not just a conduit for luxury goods and exotic curiosities. It was also a highway for fundamental innovations that changed the way human societies functioned. The spread of paper and printing technology from China revolutionized education, administration, and communication throughout the Eurasian world. The diffusion of agricultural techniques, crop varieties, and farming tools increased food production and supported population growth in regions that had previously been only marginally habitable. Medical knowledge spread along the trade routes with effects that were literally matters of life and death for millions of people. Traditional Chinese medicine reached the Middle East and Europe, while Greek and Islamic medical texts traveled to India and China. The exchange of pharmaceutical knowledge led to new treatments for diseases that had previously been incurable, and the spread of surgical techniques saved countless lives. Perhaps most importantly, the Silk Road facilitated the exchange of mathematical and scientific knowledge that laid the foundation for many later intellectual developments. The Indian concept of zero reached Europe through Islamic mathematicians who had encountered it through trade connections with India. Chinese astronomical observations contributed to the development of more accurate calendars and navigation techniques throughout the Eurasian world. The cumulative effect of these exchanges was to create a level of intellectual sophistication and cultural complexity that far exceeded what any single civilization could have achieved in isolation. By the height of the classical Silk Road period, around 700–1000 CE, the major cities along the trade routes had become centers of learning and innovation that rivaled anything in the ancient world. Libraries in Baghdad, Samarkand, and Qian contained works in dozens of languages representing the accumulated knowledge of multiple civilizations. Schools and universities attracted students from across the known world, creating international communities of scholars who could build on the insights of their predecessors from many different cultural traditions. The translation movement that flourished in the Islamic world during this period was largely made possible by the intellectual exchanges facilitated by Silk Road trade. Islamic scholars had access to Greek philosophical works, Indian mathematical texts, Persian scientific treatises, and Chinese technological manuals, allowing them to synthesize knowledge from multiple traditions into new and more sophisticated theoretical frameworks. But this golden age of Silk Road prosperity and cultural exchange was not destined to last forever. By the end of the first millennium CE, a combination of political, economic, and environmental factors was beginning to undermine the stability of the classical trading network. The fragmentation of large empires into smaller kingdoms reduced the security and predictability that long-distance trade required. Climate change made some traditional routes more difficult to traverse, while new technologies were beginning to make alternative forms of transportation more attractive. Most significantly, the rise of new maritime trade routes was beginning to provide competition for the overland Silk Road network. Improvements in shipbuilding, navigation, and port facilities were making sea travel safer and more economical for many types of goods. The maritime routes could carry much larger quantities of cargo and were less vulnerable to the political instability that plagued the overland routes. The stage was being set for the next great transformation of Eurasian trade networks. But before that transformation took place, the Silk Road would experience one final golden age under the most unlikely of patrons. The Mongol Empire, whose horsemen would sweep across the Eurasian steppes to create the largest contiguous land empire in human history, and, in the process, give the Silk Road its greatest period of prosperity and cultural exchange. The thundering hooves that echoed across the Eurasian steppes in the early 13th century carried with them not just the promise of conquest, but the seeds of the greatest commercial revolution the world had ever seen. When Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, united the fractious Mongol tribes under his leadership, few could have predicted that this nomadic confederation would create the conditions for the Silk Road's most prosperous and culturally significant period. The Mongols were not natural merchants. They were pastoralists and warriors whose traditional lifestyle had little use for the luxury goods and exotic commodities that formed the backbone of Silk Road trade. Yet within a generation of Genghis Khan's death, the Mongol Empire had become the greatest facilitator of international commerce in human history, presiding over a period of trade expansion and cultural exchange that historians now call the Pax Mongolica. The transformation began with a fundamental shift in Mongol attitudes toward conquest and governance. Unlike previous nomadic invasions, which typically aimed at plunder and destruction, the Mongols under Genghis Khan and his successors recognized that prosperous territories were more valuable as ongoing sources of tribute than as one-time sources of loot. This insight led them to develop sophisticated policies for managing conquered territories that actively promoted trade and economic development. One of the most important Mongol innovations was the concept of religious and cultural tolerance. Where previous empires had often imposed their beliefs and customs on conquered peoples, the Mongols generally allowed local populations to maintain their traditional religions, languages, and social systems as long as they paid tribute and provided military service when required. This policy had enormous benefits for trade, since merchants no longer had to worry about religious persecution or cultural conflicts when traveling through Mongol territory. The Mongol legal system, known as the Yasa, included specific protections for merchants and traders that were unprecedented in their scope and enforcement. Theft from merchants was punishable by death, and local officials who failed to protect traders in their jurisdiction faced severe penalties. The Mongols also established standardized weights, measures, and currencies throughout their empire, eliminating many of the transaction costs that had previously made long-distance trade so expensive and risky. But perhaps the most revolutionary Mongol innovation was the creation of the yam, a communication and transportation system that connected every corner of the empire through a network of relay stations, supply depots, and armed escorts. The yam was originally designed for military and administrative purposes, but it quickly became the backbone of the most efficient trading network the world had ever seen. The yam stations were typically spaced about 25 to 30 miles apart, which was roughly a day's hard ride for a mounted courier. Each station maintained fresh horses, food, and supplies for official travelers, and many also provided accommodation and services for merchants and other civilians. The network eventually included over 1,400 stations spanning from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. What made the yam so effective was not just its physical infrastructure, but the organizational systems that supported it. The Mongols developed sophisticated methods for identifying authorized travelers, tracking the movement of goods and messages, and coordinating activities across vast distances. A merchant with proper credentials could travel from Venice to Beijing with greater safety and efficiency than a medieval European could travel from Paris to Rome. The security provided by the Mongol military was equally important. Mongol armies were stationed at strategic points throughout the empire, ready to respond quickly to any threats to trade routes. Banditry, which had been a constant threat throughout the history of the Silk Road, was virtually eliminated in Mongol territory. The Mongols understood that safe trade routes were essential to the prosperity of their empire, and they were willing to invest enormous resources in maintaining security. The results were spectacular. Trade volume along the Silk Road increased by several orders of magnitude during the height of Mongol power. Goods that had previously been rare luxuries available only to the wealthiest elites became relatively common throughout the Mongol Empire. The profits from trade provided the Mongols with resources that far exceeded what they could extract through traditional forms of tribute and taxation. It was during this period of Mongol-sponsored prosperity that some of the most famous Silk Road journeys took place. The travels of Marco Polo, which began in 1271, were made possible by the unprecedented safety and efficiency of travel under Mongol rule. But Marco Polo was neither the first nor the most important Western traveler to take advantage of Mongol hospitality. Giovanni de Pien del Carpine, a Franciscan friar, had reached the Mongol capital of Karakorum in 1246, just 18 years after Genghis Khan's death. His mission was diplomatic rather than commercial, but his detailed account of Mongol society and customs provided Europeans with their first accurate information about the great empire that had emerged in the East. William of Rubruck, another Franciscan friar, undertook an even more ambitious journey to the Mongol court in 1253 to 1255. His travels took him through territories that are now parts of Turkey, Crimea, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia, providing a comprehensive overview of the ethnic and religious diversity of the Mongol Empire. Rubruck's account is particularly valuable because he was an acute observer of economic and social conditions, describing in detail the trading systems and commercial practices that he encountered. These early European travelers were followed by increasing numbers of merchants, diplomats, missionaries, and adventurers who took advantage of Mongol protection to explore regions that had been virtually inaccessible to Westerners for centuries. The flow of people and information between East and West during the Mongol period far exceeded anything that had occurred during the classical Silk Road period. Marco Polo's journey, which lasted 24 years and took him to the court of Kublai Khan, the Mongol Emperor of China, represents the pinnacle of this era of cultural exchange. But what made Polo's travels significant was not just their scope, but the detailed record he left of his experiences. His account, dictated to a fellow prisoner in a Genoese jail after his return to Europe, provided Europeans with an encyclopedic description of Asian societies, economies, and technologies. Polo's descriptions of Chinese innovations like paper money, coal heating, and the postal system seemed so fantastic to European readers that many dismissed his account as fiction. But modern historians have confirmed the accuracy of most of his observations, and his book remains one of our most valuable sources for understanding the economic and social conditions of 13th century Asia. What Polo documented was a level of economic development and technological sophistication that far exceeded anything in contemporary Europe. The cities he visited in China were larger and wealthier than any European city, with populations that included merchants from every corner of the known world. The manufacturing centers he described produced goods in quantities that seemed impossible to Europeans accustomed to small-scale craft production. The Mongol capital of Khanbaliq, modern Beijing, under Kublai Khan was perhaps the most cosmopolitan city in world history. Its population included not only Chinese and Mongols, but also Arabs, Persians, Turks, Indians, Europeans, and representatives of dozens of other ethnic groups. The court employed foreign administrators, military advisors, and technical experts, creating a truly international government that drew on the best practices of multiple civilizations. The technological exchanges facilitated by Mongol rule had profound effects on the development of human civilization. Chinese innovations like gunpowder, printing, and the compass spread westward along the trade routes, reaching Europe just in time to fuel the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. Islamic advances in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine traveled eastward, influencing the development of Chinese science and technology. But perhaps the most significant exchange was in the realm of ideas and worldviews. For the first time in human history, scholars and intellectuals from radically different civilizations had sustained contact with each other, leading to new syntheses of knowledge that transcended cultural boundaries. The Mongol court became a center of intellectual activity that attracted the finest minds from across Eurasia. The Mongol period also saw significant advances in the technology of transportation itself. Improvements in horse breeding, harness design, and veterinary care made mounted travel faster and more reliable. Innovations in cart construction and road engineering allowed for the transportation of larger and heavier loads. The development of more accurate maps and navigation techniques reduced the risks associated with long-distance travel. These technological improvements had cumulative effects that transformed the economics of long-distance trade. Goods that had previously been too bulky or perishable for long-distance transport could now be profitably shipped across continents. The increased efficiency of transportation reduced costs and travel times, making previously marginal trade routes economically viable. The Mongols also pioneered new approaches to commercial finance that made large-scale trading ventures more practical. They developed sophisticated credit systems that allowed merchants to borrow money in one part of the empire and repay it in another, reducing the risks associated with carrying large amounts of cash across dangerous territories. They created insurance mechanisms that protected traders against losses due to banditry, natural disasters, or political upheavals. These financial innovations were supported by legal frameworks that were more sophisticated and comprehensive than anything that had previously existed. Mongol commercial law included detailed regulations covering contracts, partnerships, dispute resolution, and bankruptcy. These laws were enforced consistently throughout the empire, giving merchants confidence that their rights would be protected regardless of where they conducted business. The administrative systems developed by the Mongols were equally impressive. They created the world's first truly global bureaucracy, with standardized procedures and record-keeping systems that allowed for coordination of activities across vast distances. The Mongol postal system not only carried official correspondence, but also provided commercial intelligence that allowed merchants to make informed decisions about market conditions in distant regions. The cultural effects of increased trade and communication under Mongol rule were perhaps even more significant than the economic effects. The mixing of peoples and ideas that occurred in Mongol cities created entirely new cultural syntheses that influenced art, literature, music, and philosophy throughout Eurasia. Islamic art and architecture were profoundly influenced by Chinese techniques and motifs that became available through increased trade. Chinese painting and sculpture incorporated elements from Persian and Islamic traditions. European artistic styles were transformed by exposure to Asian aesthetic principles. The result was a flowering of creative activity that produced some of the finest artistic achievements in human history. Religious syncretism reached new levels of sophistication during the Mongol period. The Mongol tolerance for religious diversity created environments where scholars from different faith traditions could engage in sustained dialogue and debate. This led to new theological developments that incorporated insights from multiple religious systems. Buddhism, in particular, underwent significant transformations as it spread along Mongol trade routes. Tibetan Buddhism emerged as a distinct tradition that combined elements from Indian Buddhism, Tibetan Bon religion, and Chinese philosophical traditions. This synthetic form of Buddhism would eventually become the dominant religion in Mongolia itself, representing one of the most successful examples of religious adaptation and cultural exchange. The Mongol period also saw the emergence of new forms of literature that reflected the cosmopolitan character of Silk Road society. Epic poems, historical chronicles, and travel narratives were composed in multiple languages and drew on storytelling traditions from across Eurasia. These works often featured heroes from different cultures and incorporated mythological elements from various traditions. Scientific and technological knowledge flourished under Mongol patronage. The Mongol rulers were keenly interested in astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and other technical fields, and they actively recruited experts from throughout their empire to work on projects of interest to the court. This led to unprecedented collaboration between scholars from different cultural backgrounds. The astronomical observations conducted at Mongol observatories in Samarkand, Beijing, and other cities were among the most accurate and comprehensive ever undertaken up to that time. These observations were made possible by the combination of Chinese observational techniques, Islamic mathematical methods, and Greek theoretical frameworks. The resulting astronomical tables and celestial maps were used for navigation and calendar making throughout Eurasia. Medical knowledge also advanced rapidly during the Mongol period. The exchange of medical texts and techniques between Chinese, Islamic, and European traditions led to new treatments and surgical procedures that saved countless lives. The Mongol postal system enabled rapid communication about disease outbreaks and treatment methods, creating the world's first international public health network. Agricultural innovations spread along the trade routes with effects that transformed food production throughout Eurasia. New crop varieties, farming techniques, and irrigation methods were adapted to local conditions and helped support population growth in regions that had previously been only marginally productive. The Mongols themselves, despite their nomadic background, became enthusiastic promoters of agricultural development in their settled territories. The exchange of manufacturing techniques was equally significant. Chinese methods for producing silk, porcelain, and paper were adapted and improved by craftsmen in Central Asia and the Middle East. Islamic techniques for metalworking, glassmaking, and textile production spread to China and influenced the development of Chinese manufacturing. European innovations in mechanics and engineering were incorporated into production systems throughout the empire. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Mongol period was the demonstration that large-scale international cooperation was possible despite enormous cultural and religious differences. The Mongol Empire included peoples speaking hundreds of different languages, practicing dozens of different religions, and living under vastly different social and economic systems. Yet, for over a century, this diverse collection of societies functioned as a single economic and political unit. The administrative and organizational techniques developed by the Mongols for managing this diversity would influence governmental and commercial practices for centuries to come. Their methods for coordinating activities across vast distances, managing cultural conflicts, and facilitating economic development provided models that were studied and emulated by later empires. The Mongol approach to cultural tolerance and religious diversity was particularly influential. Their recognition that diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness challenged prevailing assumptions about the need for cultural uniformity in successful societies. This insight would eventually contribute to the development of more pluralistic and inclusive forms of government. However, the very success of the Mongol Empire contained the seeds of its eventual decline. The enormous size of the empire made central control increasingly difficult as communication delays and administrative inefficiencies accumulated. The cultural diversity that had been a source of strength in the empire's early period became a source of division as different regions developed their own identities and interests. The conversion of different Mongol Khans to different religions created new sources of conflict within the empire. When the Ayal Khanate in Persia converted to Islam, the Yuan dynasty in China remained committed to Mongol religious traditions and Chinese Buddhism, and the Golden Horde in Russia eventually adopted Islam as well. The religious unity that had helped hold the empire together began to fracture. Economic changes also undermined Mongol unity. As different regions of the empire developed their own trading relationships and commercial interests, the central coordination that had made the empire so powerful became less important. Local rulers began to see the imperial administration as an expensive burden rather than a valuable service. The Black Death, which spread along Mongol trade routes in the 14th century, dealt a devastating blow to the empire's population and economy. The same communication and transportation networks that had facilitated trade and cultural exchange also facilitated the spread of epidemic diseases. The resulting demographic collapse disrupted trade networks and weakened the administrative systems that held the empire together. By the end of the 14th century, the Mongol Empire had fragmented into a collection of independent kingdoms that were often hostile to each other. The security and predictability that had made the Silk Road so prosperous during the Mongol period began to disappear as political instability returned to Central Asia. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East and the Ming Dynasty in China created new obstacles to long-distance trade. Both of these powers were much more restrictive in their trade policies than the Mongols had been, imposing heavy taxes on foreign merchants and limiting their access to domestic markets. The Ottomans, in particular, used their control of traditional trade routes to extract maximum revenue from European merchants seeking access to Asian goods. These political changes coincided with technological developments that were making alternative forms of trade more attractive. Improvements in shipbuilding and navigation were making maritime trade safer and more economical. The development of ocean-going vessels capable of carrying large cargoes opened up new possibilities for long-distance commerce that bypassed the overland routes entirely. The Portuguese exploration of sea routes to India and China in the late 15th and early 16th centuries marked the beginning of the end for the classical Silk Road. When Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around Africa in 1498, he opened a maritime route to Asian markets that was faster, safer, and more economical than the overland alternatives. The Spanish discovery of the Americas created entirely new patterns of global trade that further reduced the importance of the traditional Silk Road routes. The flow of silver from the Americas to Asia and the development of trans-Pacific trade routes connecting the Americas with Asia created a global trading system that no longer depended on the Central Asian routes that had been so important for over a millennium. But the decline of the classical Silk Road was not sudden or complete. Trade continued along the traditional routes well into the early modern period, and some cities in Central Asia remained important commercial centers. However, the volume and significance of this trade gradually diminished as maritime alternatives became more attractive. The cultural and intellectual exchanges that had been so important during the Mongol period also declined as political fragmentation reduced the safety and efficiency of long-distance travel. The cosmopolitan cities of Central Asia became more parochial as foreign merchants and scholars found better opportunities elsewhere. The religious and cultural tolerance that had characterized the Mongol period gave way to more rigid and exclusive forms of identity. Yet even as the classical Silk Road entered its period of decline, its legacy continued to influence the development of global trade and cultural exchange. The organizational techniques, legal frameworks, and commercial practices developed during the Silk Road's Golden Age provided foundations for later developments in international commerce. The cultural syntheses that had emerged from Silk Road exchanges continued to influence art, literature, religion, and philosophy throughout Eurasia. Most importantly, the Silk Road had demonstrated that extensive international cooperation was possible and beneficial for all participants. The prosperity and cultural achievements of the Mongol period provided a model for what could be accomplished when peoples from different backgrounds were able to work together toward common goals. This lesson would become increasingly relevant as the world moved toward the modern era of global integration. The story of the Silk Road's golden age under Mongol rule represents one of the high points of human achievement in the pre-modern world. For a brief period, it seemed as though the barriers of distance, culture, and religion that had traditionally divided human societies could be overcome through trade, tolerance, and mutual benefit. The fact that this achievement was temporary does not diminish its significance as a demonstration of human potential. As we turn to examine the later history of the Silk Road and its eventual transformation into the maritime trading systems of the modern world, we should remember that the innovations and achievements of the Mongol period laid essential groundwork for many later developments in global commerce and international relations. The dream of a world connected by trade and cultural exchange, which reached its fullest expression during the Pax Mongolica, would continue to inspire explorers, merchants, and visionaries for centuries to come. While the great caravans still wound their way across the dusty passes of Central Asia in the 15th century, a new chapter in the story of global trade was being written on the rolling swells of the world's oceans. The maritime Silk Roads, which had actually existed parallel to the overland routes for over a millennium, were about to eclipse their terrestrial cousins and reshape the entire geography of international commerce. The transition from land to sea was neither sudden nor simple. Maritime trade routes connecting east and west had existed since ancient times, carrying precious cargoes along the coasts of the Indian Ocean and through the monsoon-driven passages between India, Southeast Asia, and China. Arab dhows, Chinese junks, and Indian merchant vessels had been crossing these waters for centuries, creating a maritime network that was in many ways more efficient and economical than the overland routes. What changed in the 15th and 16th centuries was not the existence of maritime trade, but its scale, scope, and the identity of its primary beneficiaries. European powers, led by the Portuguese and Spanish, developed new technologies and navigational techniques that allowed them to bypass the traditional intermediaries who had controlled the flow of Asian goods into European markets. The story begins with a problem that had plagued European merchants for centuries: the enormous cost and complexity of acquiring Asian luxury goods through traditional channels. By the time silk, spices, and other Asian commodities reached European markets, they had passed through the hands of numerous intermediaries, each of whom added their own markup to the price. The result was that goods that were relatively inexpensive in their places of origin became fantastically expensive by the time they reached European consumers. The Ottoman Empire's control of Constantinople and the traditional Middle Eastern trade routes after 1453 made this situation even worse for European merchants. The Ottomans imposed heavy taxes on goods passing through their territory and often restricted European access to Asian markets entirely. European rulers and merchants became increasingly desperate to find alternative routes to Asia that would allow them to bypass Ottoman control and access Asian goods directly. Portuguese exploration of the African coast, which began in earnest during the 15th century, was initially motivated by the desire to find a sea route to India that would circumvent both the overland routes through Central Asia and the Ottoman-controlled routes through the Middle East. Prince Henry the Navigator, despite never having made a major sea voyage himself, sponsored dozens of expeditions that gradually extended Portuguese knowledge of the African coast. The Portuguese breakthrough came in 1488, when Bartholomew Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, proving that a sea route to India was possible. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama completed the voyage, reaching Calicut on the Indian coast and returning to Portugal with a cargo of spices that more than paid for the entire expedition. Da Gama's voyage marked the beginning of the Portuguese maritime empire in the Indian Ocean, but it also represented something more significant: the first successful European attempt to access Asian markets directly, without relying on traditional overland routes or Middle Eastern intermediaries. Within a few decades, the Portuguese had established trading posts and naval bases throughout the Indian Ocean, from Goa in India to Malacca in Malaysia to Nagasaki in Japan. The Spanish approach was different but equally revolutionary. Rather than seeking an eastern route to Asia around Africa, Christopher Columbus attempted to reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. Although Columbus's miscalculations led him to the Americas rather than Asia, the Spanish discovery of the New World opened up entirely new possibilities for global trade. The Spanish conquest of Mexico and Peru provided access to enormous quantities of silver, which became the backbone of global trade for the next 3 centuries. Spanish silver flowed across the Pacific to the Philippines, where it was exchanged for Chinese silk, porcelain, and other goods. This created a trans-Pacific trade route that connected the Americas directly with Asia, bypassing Europe entirely for many types of transactions. The Manila Galleon trade, which operated from 1565 to 1815, represented one of the most profitable and longest-lasting trade routes in history. Each year, 1 or 2 enormous galleons would carry silver from Acapulco to Manila, returning with cargoes of Asian goods that were then transported across Mexico to Europe. The profits from this trade were so enormous that a single successful voyage could provide enough revenue to support the Spanish colonial government in the Philippines for an entire year. But while the Portuguese and Spanish were establishing their maritime empires, other European powers were developing their own approaches to Asian trade. The Dutch, in particular, proved to be exceptionally successful at organizing and financing large-scale trading ventures. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, established in 1602, became the world's first true multinational corporation, with a monopoly on Dutch trade in Asia and extraordinary powers to wage war, negotiate treaties, and establish colonies. The VOC's success was based on several innovations that transformed the nature of international trade. First, they developed new forms of corporate organization that allowed them to raise enormous amounts of capital from private investors while limiting individual risk through profit-sharing arrangements. Second, they created sophisticated logistical systems that could coordinate trading activities across vast distances with unprecedented efficiency. Third, they invested heavily in military force, using armed ships and fortified trading posts to secure their commercial interests against both European competitors and local rivals. The result was a trading empire that, at its height in the 17th century, generated profits that far exceeded those of most sovereign governments. The VOC's ships carried not only traditional luxury goods like spices and silk, but also bulk commodities like rice, sugar, and timber that had never been profitable to transport over long distances using traditional methods. The Dutch success inspired other European powers to create their own trading companies. The English East India Company, established in 1600, eventually became even more powerful than its Dutch rival, ultimately conquering much of India and establishing the foundation for the British Empire. The French, Danes, and Swedes all created their own Asian trading companies, leading to intense competition for control of the most profitable routes and markets. This competition had profound effects on the traditional Silk Road routes. As European maritime trade expanded, the demand for goods transported overland through Central Asia declined dramatically. Cities that had prospered for centuries as intermediaries in the overland trade found their commercial importance diminishing as goods flowed increasingly through maritime channels. The impact was not immediate or uniform. Some overland trade continued, particularly in goods that were not well suited to maritime transport or in regions where sea routes were not available. The trade in horses, for example, remained largely overland because horses could not survive the long sea voyages required for maritime transport. Similarly, trade between neighboring regions often continued to use traditional overland routes because they remained more convenient and economical for short-distance transport. But the overall trend was unmistakable. By the 18th century, the vast majority of long-distance trade between Europe and Asia was conducted by sea rather than overland. The great Central Asian cities that had once been among the wealthiest in the world gradually lost their commercial importance and began the long process of economic decline that would characterize the region for the next several centuries. The shift to maritime trade also had significant effects on the types of goods that were traded and the scale of international commerce. Ships could carry much larger cargoes than caravans, making it economical to transport bulk commodities that had never been profitable for long-distance overland trade. This led to the development of new types of commerce, including the Atlantic slave trade, the sugar trade, and the cotton trade, that were based on the mass production and transport of relatively inexpensive goods. The technological requirements for successful maritime trade were also quite different from those required for overland commerce. Instead of needing expertise in animal husbandry, desert navigation, and caravan organization, maritime traders had to develop skills in shipbuilding, navigation, and naval warfare. The knowledge and experience that had made Central Asian people so valuable as intermediaries in overland trade became largely irrelevant in the new maritime trading system. This technological shift had important implications for the distribution of wealth and power in the global trading system. Whereas the overland Silk Road had created opportunities for prosperity throughout Central Asia, maritime trade concentrated wealth and power in a relatively small number of port cities and coastal regions. The great inland trading centers of Central Asia found themselves increasingly marginalized in the new global economy. The cultural and intellectual exchanges that had been so important during the classical Silk Road period also changed in character as trade shifted to maritime routes. Ships could carry books, manuscripts, and scholars more easily than caravans, but the concentration of maritime trade in a relatively small number of ports meant that cultural exchange became more concentrated geographically. Cities like Amsterdam, London, Venice, Goa, Malacca, and Manila became cosmopolitan centers that attracted merchants, scholars, and intellectuals from throughout the world. But the smaller cities and towns that had participated in overland trade networks found themselves increasingly isolated from international cultural exchanges. The religious implications of the shift to maritime trade were also significant. Christian missionaries, particularly Portuguese and Spanish Catholics, used maritime routes to spread Christianity throughout Asia and the Americas. This represented a new phase in the religious exchanges that had always been an important part of long-distance trade, but it was characterized by much more aggressive and systematic attempts at conversion than had been typical during the classical Silk Road period. The encounter between European Christianity and Asian religious traditions produced complex and often conflicted results. In some cases, such as in the Philippines and parts of India, Christian missions were quite successful and created lasting changes in local religious practices. In others, such as in China and Japan, initial enthusiasm for Christianity gave way to suspicion and persecution as local rulers became concerned about the political implications of foreign religious influence. The scientific and technological exchanges facilitated by maritime trade were equally complex. European explorers and traders encountered new astronomical knowledge, mathematical techniques, and technological innovations in Asia that they brought back to Europe and incorporated into their own intellectual traditions. At the same time, European innovations in navigation, cartography, and weaponry had profound effects on Asian societies. Perhaps the most significant technological exchange was in the realm of military technology. The introduction of European firearms and artillery to Asian societies had revolutionary effects on warfare, politics, and social organization throughout the region. Traditional ruling elites who were unable to adapt to the new military technologies often found themselves displaced by those who could master and deploy European-style weapons. The economic theories that developed to explain and justify the new patterns of maritime trade also had lasting influence on global economic thought. European thinkers like Adam Smith and David Ricardo developed theories of comparative advantage and free trade that were based largely on observations of maritime commerce. These theories would eventually become the foundation for modern international economic policy. But the maritime trading system that emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries was not simply a replacement for the overland Silk Road. It was a fundamentally different kind of commercial network that operated according to different principles and created different patterns of wealth and power. Where the classical Silk Road had been based on cooperation between numerous small-scale traders and local rulers, the maritime trading system was increasingly dominated by large-scale organizations that could deploy significant financial and military resources. Where the overland routes had created opportunities for prosperity throughout the regions they traversed, maritime trade concentrated wealth in a relatively small number of strategic locations. Most significantly, where the classical Silk Road had been characterized by cultural tolerance and religious diversity, the new maritime trading system was often associated with aggressive cultural imperialism and religious conversion. European traders and colonizers generally showed much less respect for local customs and beliefs than the cosmopolitan merchants of the classical Silk Road period. These changes reflected broader transformations in European society that were occurring during the early modern period. The development of more centralized and powerful nation-states gave European rulers both the resources and the motivation to pursue aggressive overseas expansion. The religious conflicts of the Reformation period created intense pressure for religious uniformity that was often extended to overseas territories. The scientific revolution and the Enlightenment also contributed to European confidence in the superiority of their own culture and institutions. Where medieval European travelers like Marco Polo had generally expressed admiration for the advanced civilizations they encountered in Asia, early modern European writers increasingly portrayed Asian societies as backward and in need of European guidance and reform. The environmental consequences of the shift to maritime trade were also quite different from those of overland commerce. Maritime trade allowed for the transport of much larger quantities of goods over much greater distances, leading to unprecedented levels of resource extraction and environmental transformation. The demand for tropical products like sugar, coffee, and tobacco led to the creation of plantation systems that had devastating effects on local ecosystems and indigenous populations. The introduction of New World crops to Asia and Old World crops to the Americas, facilitated by maritime trade routes, created what historians call the Columbian Exchange. This biological exchange had profound effects on global agriculture, population growth, and environmental change that continue to influence our world today. The demographic consequences were equally significant. The spread of Old World diseases to the Americas caused population collapses that were among the most catastrophic in human history. At the same time, the introduction of New World crops like potatoes and maize to Asia and Europe supported population growth that helped fund the expansion of maritime trading empires. The cultural exchanges facilitated by maritime trade were also more complex and often more conflicted than those that had characterized the classical Silk Road. The power imbalances between European colonizers and indigenous populations created patterns of cultural dominance and resistance that were quite different from the relatively egalitarian exchanges of the earlier period. European languages, legal systems, and educational institutions were imposed throughout the colonial world, often displacing local traditions and knowledge systems. But indigenous peoples were not passive recipients of European culture. They adapted, modified, and selectively adopted European innovations while maintaining elements of their traditional cultures. The result was the creation of new hybrid cultures that combined elements from multiple traditions in ways that were often quite different from what European colonizers had intended. These cultural syntheses, which emerged in places like Latin America, the Philippines, and parts of India, represented new forms of cultural creativity that were unique products of the maritime trading era. The artistic and literary works produced in these colonial societies often reflected the complex cultural negotiations that were taking place. Artists and writers found ways to express traditional themes and values using European forms and techniques, or conversely, to use traditional forms to comment on European ideas and institutions. The intellectual exchanges of the maritime era also had lasting effects on the development of human knowledge. European scholars gained access to Asian philosophical and scientific traditions that had been largely unknown in Europe, while Asian intellectuals encountered European ideas that challenged traditional ways of understanding the world. These encounters led to new synthetic intellectual traditions that combined insights from multiple cultural sources. The development of comparative religion, comparative philosophy, and comparative science as academic disciplines reflected the new awareness of cultural diversity that was one of the most important legacies of the maritime trading era. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the shift to maritime trade was the creation of a truly global economic system for the first time in human history. Where the classical Silk Road had connected Europe and Asia through a series of regional networks, the maritime trading system of the early modern period created direct connections between all inhabited continents. The flow of silver from the Americas to Asia, the transport of African slaves to the Americas, the movement of Asian goods to Europe, and the exchange of plants, animals, and diseases between all regions created a level of global integration that was unprecedented in scope and significance. This global system provided the foundation for all subsequent developments in international trade and cultural exchange. As we move toward the modern period, the story of the Silk Road becomes increasingly complex and multifaceted. The traditional overland routes did not simply disappear when maritime alternatives became available. Instead, they adapted to new circumstances and continued to play important roles in regional and international commerce. The rediscovery and archaeological investigation of ancient Silk Road sites in the 19th and 20th centuries would reveal new secrets about these ancient trading networks and inspire new appreciation for their historical significance. The 19th century brought an unexpected resurrection to the forgotten cities of the Silk Road, though this time the explorers carried cameras instead of caravans, and their treasure was knowledge rather than silk. As the great powers of Europe expanded their influence across Central Asia, a new breed of adventure scholars began to uncover the buried secrets of the ancient trade routes, revealing lost cities, forgotten manuscripts, and artistic treasures that had been hidden beneath the desert sands for over 1,000 years. The rediscovery began with the Great Game, the 19th century rivalry between the British and Russian empires for control of Central Asia. Both powers sent expeditions into the region ostensibly for strategic and commercial purposes. But these expeditions often included scholars and archaeologists who were fascinated by the historical significance of the territories they were exploring. One of the first to recognize the archaeological potential of the region was Alexander Burns, a British officer who traveled through Central Asia in the 1830s. Burns documented numerous ancient ruins and artifacts that provided evidence of the region's former prosperity and cultural sophistication. His accounts sparked interest among European scholars and helped establish Central Asian archaeology as a legitimate field of study. But it was the systematic expeditions of the early 20th century that truly revolutionized our understanding of Silk Road history. Aurel Stein, a Hungarian-British archaeologist and geographer, conducted 4 major expeditions to Central Asia between 1900 and 1930 that uncovered some of the most important archaeological finds in human history. Stein's first expedition, in 1900 to 1901, focused on the southern rim of the Taklamakan Desert, where shifting sands had preserved ancient cities in remarkable condition. At Dunhuang, he discovered a Buddhist monastery that had been abandoned in the 8th century but remained virtually intact, complete with wooden statues, painted panels, and manuscript fragments that provided unprecedented insights into the religious and cultural life of Silk Road communities. Even more spectacular was Stein's discovery of the lost city of Naya, which had been buried by sand dunes for over 1,500 years. The dry desert conditions had preserved organic materials that would have decomposed anywhere else, including wooden documents written in the Kharosthi script, textile fragments showing sophisticated weaving techniques, and even ancient fruit and grain that provided evidence of the agricultural systems that had sustained these communities. But Stein's most famous discovery came during his second expedition in 1906 to 1908, when he reached the Mogeo Caves at Dunhuang. These caves, carved into cliff faces outside the ancient trading city, had served as Buddhist monasteries and libraries for over 1,000 years. In one sealed cave, designated Cave 17, Stein found what may be the greatest archaeological treasure trove ever discovered. The cave contained over 40,000 manuscripts and documents in a dozen different languages and scripts, along with hundreds of paintings, textiles, and other artifacts. The collection included Buddhist scriptures, Confucian classics, Christian texts, Manichaean documents, secular literature, commercial records, and official correspondence spanning nearly 1,000 years of Silk Road history. Among the most significant finds was the Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist text dated 868 CE that represents the world's oldest known printed book. The cave also contained the Dunhuang star chart, the most accurate astronomical map produced before the invention of the telescope, and thousands of documents that provided detailed information about daily life in a Silk Road trading city. The Dunhuang manuscripts revolutionized scholarly understanding of Silk Road history. For the first time, historians had access to contemporary accounts of how the trade routes actually functioned, rather than having to rely on the often unreliable reports of foreign travelers. The documents revealed the complex administrative systems, legal frameworks, and commercial practices that had made long-distance trade possible. They also provided unprecedented insights into the cultural and religious diversity of Silk Road communities. The presence of texts in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Khotanese, Hebrew, and other languages demonstrated the cosmopolitan character of these trading cities. The variety of religious documents showed how Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, and other faiths had coexisted and influenced each other. Stein was not the only explorer making significant discoveries during this period. Sven Hedin, a Swedish geographer, conducted several expeditions that mapped previously unknown regions of Central Asia and discovered numerous archaeological sites. Paul Pelliot, a French sinologist, also worked at Dunhuang and made important contributions to the study of the manuscript collection. The German Turfen expeditions, led by Albert Grunwedel and Albert von Lecoq between 1902 and 1914, focused on the northern Silk Road routes and uncovered spectacular wall paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts from sites like Bezeklik and Kizil. These discoveries revealed the sophisticated artistic traditions that had developed in the oasis cities along the trade routes. Russian expeditions led by scholars like Dmitry Clements and Sergei Oldenburg explored sites along the northern routes and contributed significantly to our understanding of the cultural exchanges between Central Asia and the Eurasian steppes. Their work revealed how nomadic peoples had participated in and been influenced by Silk Road trade. The cumulative effect of these expeditions was to transform scholarly understanding of Central Asian history and the significance of the Silk Road. What had previously been seen as a peripheral region inhabited by barbarian nomads was revealed to be a sophisticated civilization that had played a crucial role in connecting the great cultures of Eurasia. The archaeological discoveries also sparked new interest in the Silk Road among the general public. Popular accounts of the expeditions, often written by the explorers themselves, captured the imagination of readers in Europe and America. The romance of discovering lost cities and ancient treasures in exotic locations appealed to audiences who were fascinated by adventure stories and archaeological mysteries. Museums throughout Europe competed to acquire Silk Road artifacts, creating major collections that introduced millions of visitors to the art, culture, and history of the ancient trade routes. The British Museum, the Berlin Museum für Asiatische Kunst, the Musée Guémet in Paris, and other institutions built world-renowned collections based on the discoveries of the early 20th century expeditions. But the enthusiasm for collecting Silk Road artifacts also created ethical controversies that continue to this day. Many of the expeditions operated with minimal oversight from local authorities and removed large quantities of artifacts from their original contexts. The governments of modern Central Asian nations have often criticized these removals as cultural theft, and have sought the return of important artifacts to their countries of origin. The political context of the early expeditions also complicated their legacy. Many of the explorers were working for imperial governments that had their own strategic and commercial interests in Central Asia. The archaeological work was often conducted in conjunction with intelligence gathering and political mapping that served broader imperial agendas. This colonial context influenced both the methods and the interpretations of the early archaeological work. Explorers often focused on discovering spectacular artifacts that would impress European audiences rather than conducting systematic studies of Silk Road societies. Their accounts frequently emphasized the exotic and mysterious aspects of their discoveries, while downplaying evidence of sophisticated local cultures and political systems. Despite these limitations, the early expeditions established Central Asian archaeology as a legitimate field of study and created foundations for more systematic research that would follow. The artifacts and documents they collected continue to provide valuable information for scholars studying Silk Road history, and their discoveries fundamentally changed how historians understand the role of Central Asia in world history. The rediscovery of the Silk Road coincided with and contributed to broader changes in historical scholarship during the early 20th century. Historians began to move away from narratives focused on individual nations and empires toward more global perspectives that emphasized connections and exchanges between different societies. The Silk Road became a powerful symbol of this new approach to world history. Scholars like Owen Lattimore and William McNeill used Silk Road studies to develop new theoretical frameworks for understanding how civilizations interacted across long distances. Their work emphasized the importance of trade, migration, and cultural exchange in shaping historical development, challenging traditional approaches that had focused primarily on political and military events. The development of new analytical techniques also enhanced scholarly understanding of Silk Road artifacts and documents. Scientific analysis of textiles revealed sophisticated dyeing and weaving techniques that had been developed along the trade routes. Chemical analysis of pigments in wall paintings showed how artistic materials and techniques had spread between different cultural traditions. Linguistic analysis of the multilingual documents from Dunhuang and other sites revealed how languages had evolved and influenced each other in the cosmopolitan environment of Silk Road cities. Literary scholars discovered how storytelling traditions, poetic forms, and literary themes had been transmitted along the trade routes. The study of Silk Road religions became a major focus of scholarly research, revealing how Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and other faiths had adapted to new cultural environments as they spread along the trade routes. Scholars discovered how religious syncretism had created new forms of belief and practice that combined elements from multiple traditions. Art historians traced how artistic styles and techniques had evolved as they moved along the trade routes, creating new hybrid traditions that reflected the multicultural character of Silk Road societies. The discovery of Greco-Buddhist art in Gandhara, for example, revealed how Greek sculptural techniques had been adapted to create distinctively Buddhist artistic forms. Archaeological techniques also advanced significantly during the 20th century, allowing for more sophisticated analysis of Silk Road sites. Stratigraphic excavation methods provided better understanding of how sites had developed over time. Carbon dating and other scientific techniques allowed for more accurate chronology of discoveries. Aerial photography and satellite imagery revolutionized the discovery of new sites. Researchers could identify the remains of ancient cities, irrigation systems, and road networks that were invisible from ground level. These techniques led to the discovery of numerous previously unknown sites and revealed the true extent of the Silk Road network. The political changes of the 20th century had complex effects on Silk Road research. The Russian Revolution and the establishment of the Soviet Union created new opportunities for research in some areas while restricting access to others. Soviet scholars made important contributions to Silk Road studies, but their work was often limited by ideological constraints and limited contact with international scholarly communities. The Chinese Civil War and the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 also affected Silk Road research. Chinese scholars began systematic excavation and study of sites within China's borders, making important discoveries that had previously been inaccessible to foreign researchers. But political tensions often limited cooperation between Chinese and foreign scholars. The independence of Central Asian republics following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 created new opportunities for international collaboration in Silk Road research. Scholars from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan began working with international partners to study their country's Silk Road heritage. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed aspects of Silk Road history that were invisible to earlier researchers. Ground-penetrating radar can detect buried structures without excavation. DNA analysis of ancient human remains reveals migration patterns and population exchanges. Isotope analysis of artifacts can determine their origins and trade routes. Environmental archaeology has provided new insights into how climate change affected Silk Road societies. Analysis of pollen samples, tree rings, and lake sediments reveals how environmental changes influenced agricultural production, water availability, and settlement patterns along the trade routes. The development of Geographic Information Systems, GIS, has allowed researchers to map Silk Road networks with unprecedented precision. Digital analysis of trade routes, settlement patterns, and environmental factors has revealed how the network evolved over time and adapted to changing conditions. Economic analysis of Silk Road trade has also become more sophisticated. Scholars can now estimate trade volumes, analyze price fluctuations, and study the economic impacts of long-distance commerce with much greater precision than was previously possible. This research has revealed the enormous scale and complexity of Silk Road economic systems. The digital revolution has transformed how Silk Road research is conducted and disseminated. International databases now make it possible for scholars to access information about artifacts and documents located in museums and collections throughout the world. Digital imaging techniques allow for detailed analysis of fragile manuscripts and artworks without damaging them. Virtual reality and 3D modeling technologies are being used to reconstruct ancient Silk Road cities and trading centers, allowing researchers and the public to experience these sites as they would have appeared during their periods of prosperity. These technologies provide new ways of understanding and communicating the historical significance of the Silk Road. The 21st century has witnessed a remarkable revival of interest in the Silk Road, driven in part by China's Belt and Road Initiative, announced by President Xi Jinping in 2013. This massive infrastructure project explicitly invokes the historical Silk Road as a model for modern economic cooperation between Asia, Europe, and Africa. The Belt and Road Initiative includes both a land-based Silk Road economic belt and a maritime 21st-century maritime Silk Road that echo the ancient trade networks but use modern transportation and communication technologies. The project aims to connect over 60 countries through improved infrastructure, enhanced trade relationships, and increased cultural exchanges. The initiative has sparked renewed global interest in Silk Road history and has led to increased funding for archaeological research and cultural preservation projects along the ancient trade routes. Museums and cultural institutions throughout the world have organized major exhibitions exploring Silk Road themes, introducing new generations to the history and significance of these ancient networks. But the modern revival of Silk Road concepts has also generated debates about the political and economic implications of these initiatives. Critics argue that modern projects that invoke Silk Road symbolism may serve contemporary geopolitical agendas rather than genuinely promoting the kind of multicultural cooperation that characterized the historical trade networks. Supporters argue that the Silk Road provides valuable lessons for modern global cooperation and that infrastructure development and economic integration can promote peace and prosperity in ways that echo the historical benefits of long-distance trade. They point to the success of historical Silk Road societies in managing cultural diversity and maintaining peaceful cooperation across vast distances. The environmental implications of modern Silk Road initiatives have also generated considerable discussion. The historical trade routes generally had relatively modest environmental impacts because of the limited scale of pre-industrial technology. Modern infrastructure projects operate on much larger scales and may have significant environmental consequences that require careful management. Cultural preservation has become an increasingly important concern as modern development threatens historical Silk Road sites. Many ancient cities and monuments are vulnerable to damage from construction projects, tourism, and environmental change. International organizations are working to protect these sites while still allowing for economic development in the regions where they are located. The study of Silk Road history has also contributed to contemporary discussions about globalization and cultural exchange. Historians argue that the Silk Road provides examples of how globalization can operate in ways that respect cultural diversity and promote mutual benefit rather than cultural homogenization or economic exploitation. The cosmopolitan character of historical Silk Road societies offers models for how modern multicultural societies might manage diversity and promote integration while respecting different cultural traditions. The commercial law, diplomatic practices, and conflict resolution mechanisms developed by Silk Road traders provide insights that may be relevant for contemporary international relations. Educational institutions throughout the world have developed Silk Road studies programs that examine the historical networks from interdisciplinary perspectives. These programs bring together historians, archaeologists, linguists, art historians, economists, geographers, and other specialists to study the complex interactions that characterized Silk Road societies. The popularity of Silk Road themes in literature, film, and popular culture has also contributed to public understanding of their historical significance. Novels, documentaries, and travel accounts have introduced millions of people to Silk Road history and sparked interest in visiting the regions where these ancient trade networks operated. Tourism along modern Silk Road routes has become a significant economic factor in many Central Asian countries. Visitors from throughout the world come to see archaeological sites, historic cities, and cultural monuments associated with the ancient trade networks. This tourism provides economic benefits for local communities, while also creating incentives for cultural preservation. The culinary legacy of the Silk Road has also gained recognition as global cuisine has become more sophisticated and diverse. Restaurants throughout the world now serve dishes that reflect the culinary exchanges that occurred along the ancient trade routes. The fusion of different cooking traditions that characterized Silk Road cities provides inspiration for contemporary chefs and food enthusiasts. The artistic traditions developed along the Silk Road continue to influence contemporary art and design. Modern artists draw inspiration from the multicultural artistic syntheses that emerged from Silk Road exchanges, creating new works that reflect similar themes of cultural interaction and global connectivity. As we reflect on the long history of the Silk Road, from its origins in ancient Chinese silk production to its modern revival in contemporary infrastructure projects, several themes emerge that remain relevant for our interconnected world. The first is the importance of trade and economic cooperation in promoting peace and cultural understanding between different societies. Throughout its history, the Silk Road demonstrated that economic interdependence could overcome political and cultural differences, creating incentives for cooperation even between societies that might otherwise be hostile to each other. The prosperity generated by long-distance trade provided resources that could be invested in education, art, and cultural development, creating positive cycles of growth and innovation. The second theme is the value of cultural diversity and intellectual exchange in promoting human progress. The cosmopolitan character of Silk Road societies, where people from different backgrounds could interact on relatively equal terms, created environments that fostered innovation and creativity. The greatest achievements of Silk Road civilizations often emerged from the synthesis of ideas and techniques from multiple cultural traditions. The third theme is the importance of tolerance and mutual respect in managing cultural diversity. The most successful Silk Road societies were those that found ways to accommodate different religions, languages, and social customs while maintaining social cohesion and political stability. Their experiences provide valuable lessons for contemporary multicultural societies. The fourth theme is the adaptability and resilience of trading networks in the face of political, economic, and environmental challenges. The Silk Road survived for over a millennium because it could adapt to changing conditions, finding new routes when old ones became unsafe and developing new products when traditional commodities lost their appeal. The fifth theme is the unintended consequences of long-distance connections. The same networks that carried goods and ideas also transmitted diseases, military technologies, and political influences that could have destabilizing effects on the societies they connected. The history of the Silk Road reminds us that globalization has both benefits and risks that require careful management. As our modern world becomes increasingly interconnected through digital communications, global trade, and cultural exchange, the lessons of Silk Road history become more relevant than ever. The ancient trade routes provide examples of how human societies can benefit from connection and cooperation while maintaining their distinctive identities and traditions. The archaeological treasures and historical documents discovered along the Silk Road continue to reveal new insights about these remarkable networks of exchange. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of how ancient peoples created, and maintained connections across vast distances, overcoming barriers of geography, culture, and politics to build one of the most successful international systems in human history. The story of the Silk Road reminds us that globalization is not a recent phenomenon, but rather a recurring theme in human history. The ancient merchants who carried silk from China to Rome, the monks who translated Buddhist texts into dozens of languages, and the artists who created new forms of beauty by combining traditions from multiple cultures were all participating in the same fundamental human impulse to connect, explore, and exchange that continues to drive our modern world. As we face contemporary challenges of international cooperation, cultural understanding, and sustainable development, we can draw inspiration from the achievements of our Silk Road predecessors. Their success in creating prosperity through diversity, their innovations in managing complex international relationships, and their legacy of cultural and artistic achievement provide both inspiration and practical guidance for building a better future. The whisper of ancient caravan bells may have faded from the desert winds, but the spirit of the Silk Road lives on in every act of international cooperation, every cultural exchange, and every effort to build bridges between different peoples and societies. In our modern interconnected world, we are all inheritors of the Silk Road tradition, carrying forward the ancient dream of a world united by trade, enriched by diversity, and strengthened by mutual understanding. The secrets of the Silk Road are not buried in the past, but live on in the continuing human story of connection, discovery, and hope. As we build the trade networks and cultural bridges of the future, we can learn from the wisdom of those ancient merchants and travelers who first proved that the greatest treasures are not the goods we carry, but the bonds we forge with those we meet along the way. And there you have it, fellow travelers through time, the complete story of the Silk Road, from its humble beginnings with a cocoon in a cup of tea to its modern resurrection in contemporary global initiatives. This network of routes didn't just carry silk and spices. It carried the very essence of human connection, proving that even the vastest deserts and highest mountains couldn't stop people from reaching out to each other in friendship and trade. If you've enjoyed this journey through the sands of time and the echoes of ancient caravan bells, please give this video a like. It really helps the channel reach more fellow history enthusiasts. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, so you won't miss our future explorations into the hidden corners of the past. Until next time, sweet dreams, and may your own journeys be filled with the same spirit of discovery that drove those brave merchants along the greatest trade network the world has ever known.